Okay, should we start? Can you hear me? Does the mic work? Yeah. That's fine. Welcome to this breakfast forum. This is part of the book launch we are having today, 3 events. This book has recently come out. So we are going to have 3 events today. One is this talk about Ghana and talk about civil society, activism, and what activism can do in terms of getting some wins in the fight against corruption. Later today, I will have a presentation on the more theoretical, conceptual background of the book, making the distinction between extraction and power preservation. And in the after lunch at 1 o'clock, we will have a proper presentation of the book with 3 authors and myself as the editor. Now we have the pleasure of having Moses Khisa. He's an assistant professor in political science at North Carolina State University in the US, Raleigh, US. We have David Jackson, senior advisor at U4, and myself, senior researcher at CMI. The question today is, what does it take for social activists to bring corrupt leaders to account? And we have a number of examples, especially Moses has a number of examples from Ghana, drawing on his chapter in the book on Ghana that he wrote together with
Kofi Asante.
Yeah, Kofi Asante, that's right. Mm-hmm. Maybe I should leave the word to you first, Moses. You can make an introduction for us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall I go?
Yes, please.
All right.
Go ahead.
All right.
Sorry.
Yep. All right. So thank you all for coming out early this morning and when there's no daylight yet. And thank you to my colleague Inge. I would be remiss not to thank our colleague Dr. Inge Amdisen for leading this project with remarkable efficiency and extraordinary commitment. He has driven through the project from start to completion and done a lot of the heavy lifting, from conceiving the project to getting a lineup of contributors, doing the onerous editorial work, and coordinating the peer review process. I would say it is because of his intrepid and tireless efforts that we are here today to talk about the book and indeed to launch it. At a very personal level, I am very grateful to Inge for the kind invitation to come to Bergen, although not the right time of the year for me to be visiting. I hope I can come back next time when it is better time to be here, when there is more light outside than darkness. So it's a pleasure for me to be here and to speak at this book launch. So thank you very much, Inge, for the kind invitation. What I will do is speak less to what it takes to succeed as civil society and the media, although I will say a bit about that. I think because you can read in the book, you can read for yourself the cases that we studied and what was involved and the processes. What I would like to focus on and highlight today are the constraints, the challenges, why it becomes very difficult for civil society activism and for media activism to actually succeed in dealing with questions of grand corruption. What are the impediments? What are the key constraints that activists face? But let me start with some general conceptual and analytical framing. I know that my colleague, Dr. Amdzen, will lay out later our overall approach for the project, in which we try to divorce grand corruption of a political nature from bureaucratic corruption, which sometimes can be petty and involves low-level civil servants. So you have political corruption as a fairly distinct category of this broad, concept of corruption. By corruption being of a political nature, what we mean is the range of activities and practices involving individuals who are politically connected and who engage in actions that lead to preserving the existing political system or for extraction of resources for personal accumulation. Incidents of political corruption, I would argue, can be both power-preserving and extractive. And again, we'll talk more about this later in the day. Now, as we demonstrate in the case of Ghana, and as I argue in the case of Uganda, there is a clear feedback loop between extracting resources through corruption for personal aggrandizement on the one hand, and using those resources to fund and preserve the status quo political regime. These two tend to feed into each other. Now, the case of Ghana is quite puzzling in many respects, but especially because Ghana has emerged as a fairly well-consolidated electoral democracy that has made significant strides in attaining the status of a truly African liberal democracy. The country has established the norm of peaceful change of government and alternation between the two main political parties, the National Democratic Congress, NDC, and the New Patriotic Party, the NPP. The NDC has won elections 6 times, and the NPP has won 3 times since the return to multi-party politics in 1992. So between these two parties over the last 3 decades, they have competed fairly and in a very transparent manner in a series of election cycles, and each one of them has lost elections at least more than once, which establishes an important criterion and yardstick for attaining democratic consolidation, which is the 2 turnover rule that Samuel Huntington laid out in 1991, i.e., that for us to be sure that a country has attained democratic consolidation, a party in power has to lose elections and be in opposition, and the one that wins elections also in turn can lose subsequently. So we need to have at least 2 turnovers of government for us to be sure that some semblance of democratic consolidation has been attained. And Ghana has achieved that. Yet, the country remains plagued by cases of large-scale corruption and financial malfeasance involving political elites and private sector actors. In theory, we would expect that a country's public sector becomes more open and transparent as the country democratizes. In other words, democratization is supposed to bring about increased public scrutiny through a vibrant media and civil society. And consequently, that would mean, at least in theory, that there is a pushback against corruption. More democratization should lead to more public accountability, more transparency, and so less corruption. Since 2000, in 2000, the then opposition party, the NPP, made history by defeating the incumbent NDC party. That victory came through in part because the NPP's presidential candidate, John Kufuor, ran on an anti-corruption campaign platform. That was one of his key selling points, that he was going to fight corruption. His government initially undertook several measures aimed at assuring accountability. One of the most important measures that his government took was, in fact, to repeal a series of draconian media laws that allowed for a freer and more open media landscape in Ghana. Therefore, since the early 2000s, Ghana has experienced an explosion in the media and investigative journalism, along with a vibrant and highly spirited civil society. With an open and relatively free media landscape, compared to the previous era of the military regime in the 1980s and the quasi-authoritarian regime of Jerry Rawlings in 1990s, since the early 2000s, the Ghanaian media has carried several corruption scandals, has published exposés of large-scale graft involving senior government officials, politicians, and politically connected actors in the civil society. These so many scandals and cases have been so numerous as to be studied exhaustively, all of them. So what we did in this chapter on Ghana was to select 4 cases that straddle governments of the 2 political parties, the NDC and the NPP. Now, with the shift in the media landscape and the media becoming freer and more open and more vibrant civil society, with a lot of civil society activism, especially with social media coming into play as well, there has been an increase in exposing grand corruption. So perhaps could we say that the open media landscape and social media and activism make it possible for the unearthing of corruption cases, which would compare with the past, where the media was constrained and it wasn't possible to actually expose those cases, where the media freedom was far more limited. So in other words, could it be that it's an open media that has made the exposing of cases possible, and not so much that the cases of grand corruption have actually increased? In other words, for a fairly open and liberalized country like Ghana, can we say that it is far more possible to expose wrongdoing and cast a spotlight on corruption compared to countries that are ranked highly as being less corrupt, like Rwanda, but which have huge constraints on the media? Now, this question is debatable. I mean, I would say perhaps, you can say that in a more open society, there is bound to be more exposure of wrongdoing than in, say, an authoritarian, regime where the media is far more constrained. But what is not in dispute is that Ghana has a big corruption problem that remains rather deep-seated and endemic. So, as we show in the book, the new government that came into power in 2001 of John Kufuor, elected on an anti-corruption platform, nevertheless was hit with a big corruption saga a few years later, what we refer to as the kickback saga, allegedly involving the president himself in receiving hefty donations from the private sector and from individuals who had been getting government contracts, big money government contracts. This trend has remained quite consistent and lasted over the past many decades. It's remained consistent. During campaign time, the main opposition party, of John Kufuor, campaigned on an anti-corruption platform. The NDC, as the opposition party in 2008, did the same thing, also campaigned as the party of anti-corruption. But regardless of who is in government and who is in the opposition, the structure has remained the same, that you have these grand cases of corruption happening, whether it is the NPP or the NDC in power. Most recently, in 2016, the main opposition candidate then of the NPP, because the NDC was the one in power, Nana Akufo-Addo, promised to appoint a special anti-corruption prosecutor. And true to his promise, he appointed one. A tough and no-nonsense Mr. Martin Amido, a former Attorney General for the NDC. So he comes from the other party, not the NPP party, but he gets appointed to be the anti-corruption czar by the NPP president. Nevertheless, the new anti-corruption special prosecutor has in fact been on a collision path with the Attorney General, who is an NPP Attorney General. And in recent months has in fact accused the two parties, the NDC, which is now in opposition, and the NPP, which is in government, of colluding to fail his work as the prosecutor against corruption. Both sides supposedly see him as a thorn in their flesh. So consequently, he has been denied the sort of resources that he needs to actually prosecute corruption, although initially there was goodwill on the part of the president. Now, in Ghana, even with all the work that civil society activists have done, and the media, and investigative journalism that has, been done for many years, it is very difficult, for example, for public servants to be compelled to declare their wealth, which is required by law. Neither the NDC nor the NPP compels their ministers to comply with the law. So, one of the questions I wanted to sort of ask and share some thoughts with you folks is, why is prosecuting political corruption in a country like Ghana rather difficult? And why does media and civil society activism tend to fail, or at least not to deliver in a way that would be expected, or at least desired? And Inge, I don't know how much time I still have.
You can take another 5 minutes.
Very good. Okay, good. First, ironically, democracy itself and the rule of law and judicial institutions are used to fail the fight against corruption. Politicians know how to play the game and how to hide behind judicial technicalities and judicial processes in court, and they use the appeal process to delay things forever. This has happened in many cases in Ghana, and we analyze some of those in the chapter. There was the case of the Minister of Health, Richard Anane, one of the cases that we analyze. He was convicted for abuse of office after being found to have, spent money that he couldn't account for. So the Commission of Human Rights and Administrative Justice, which is one of the agencies in Ghana that, among other things, is charged with issues to do with corruption, convicted him for abuse of office. But he appealed in court and won on the ground that the Commission had instituted proceedings against him without getting a formal complaint from the public. So the court ruled that the Commission could not be the complainant and prosecute the minister at the same time. The complaint should have come from the public. That was just a technical detail. It is not that the minister was innocent, but that the proper procedure hadn't been followed. So politicians and people in the private sector in Ghana know how to play the system and how to game it. They can hire the most experienced and well-connected attorneys and lawyers in town who are able to use the judicial process to actually delay and defeat the fight against corruption. The second point I want to underline is, many politicians in an electorally competitive country like Uganda are always looking at the next election. Okay, the fierce competition between the NPP and the NDC means that both of them are always looking for raising campaign funds, campaign financing, and going after the corrupt who are accused of wrongdoing. Either party, is a bit guarded because there is the, realization that they are going after their supporters who are also their funders. And so to prosecute them, to prosecute those who have been fingered in corrupt practices is to injure, is to hurt your chances of raising campaign funds. And by extension, it means hurting your chances at the polls. The third point is the old ethnicity problem that many African countries face. In Ghana, an ethnically diverse country, whichever president comes into power finds that he is heavily constrained, going hard and fast against the corrupt if they are his co-ethnics. And so it becomes an issue of, whoever gets accused of, grand corruption and happens to be a co-ethnic or at least, socially connected to the president can run to the president for protection. And that has happened in many cases, some of which we speak to briefly in the chapter. The fourth point I want to underline is that, agencies like the Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice and even the recently created Office of the Special Prosecutor are short on resources, both human and financial. They lack the competent and skilled lawyers who can actually prosecute cases, and not to mention limitations of financial resources. The other point is that there is the problem of appointing ministers from among members of parliament. This is a constitutional requirement in the Ghanaian constitution, that the president has to appoint the majority of members of his cabinet from among members of parliament. What this does is two things. One, it heavily undermines the independence of parliament and the oversight role that parliament is supposed to play, because you have members of parliament who are also members of cabinet, and they are enjoying they have to go by the principle of collective responsibility. Once something happens in government, in the executive, it is their collective responsibility. And so back in parliament, they cannot hold the executive accountable because they are part of the executive. But the second point, which is I think even more important, is that many members of parliament are always looking to being appointed members of cabinet. And so, in parliament, they cannot go too hard on the executive, on the president, on the ministers, because they too are hoping that they can be appointed to cabinet. The civil society and the media and the academia have made the case for amending the constitution to change this requirement in the constitution, but the two parties have been less reluctant to take up the matter, so it remains that is the provision. The other point is that the media, which has done a lot, and members of civil society too, have become rather compromised. So there have been recent cases and allegations of activists in civil society, but especially investigative journalists who have also engaged in extortion of their own. So, so the watchdog role that the media is supposed to play is in peril because certain individuals too have been, singled and accused of, being engaged in extracting from their work of investigative journalism and reporting on corruption. Let me make one last point, that just as is the case in many other countries, in Ghana, the fight against corruption is sometimes politically instrumentalized, such that the government in power goes after its opponents, but not its supporters. And so the fight against corruption becomes more political than legal or technical. Now, by way of winding up, and I think I'm out of time, sorry, let me point out that there have been many instances and many cases where the media and civil society have registered important victories and made some significant successes as regards to cases of grand corruption, and we talk about those in the chapter. They definitely the open media landscape in Ghana, the work that civil society activists, especially one organization that came up during this era of the social media and called itself #Occupy Ghana. They have done a lot in terms of taking cases to the courts, including up to the Supreme Court, and they have had victories there. And they have had victories by being relentless, by pursuing cases, to their conclusion. But they have also failed in many cases because they have failed to, understand the procedural, loopholes that the corrupt exploit to be able to defeat the cause of justice. So I'll end there, and perhaps we'll have another conversation during Q&A. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Moses. Ghana, the example of Ghana, in my view, points to two very pertinent questions. As you said, it's politically liberal. There have been several elections, change of government according to people's will, open media landscape, freedom of association and all that, which theoretically and also empirically seems to be the best way of curbing corruption. But still, Ghana has a huge corruption problem, even reaching up to the level of the president. So one of the pertinent questions is, why is that? Why does it take so long? Some researchers have pointed to the fact that to win elections, you have to have a lot of money.
Yeah.
So elections in themselves is a corruption driver. David, are you subscribing to this, what should we say, analysis?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I first have to work out how to turn this on.
There's a very small button on this.
I think on the top.
Yeah. Thank you, Inga. Can people hear me? Is that fine?
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you, Moses, also too, for that very interesting story about what's going on in Ghana. And I would agree with Inga. I mean, Moses mentioned something very interesting, and he summed it up very well. The structure remains the same.
Yep.
So despite there being democratic reforms and despite, as Inga said, peaceful change in power, corruption remained the same, which made me think that democratization does not lead directly in a straight line to less corruption.
Immediately.
In fact, what we do see is democratization increasing corruption in many instances. Because once you open up for different groups, once you open up the spoils of the state to different groups, then this can lead to, as you said, more corruption in order to try and win those spoils and maintain those spoils, so patronage and other kinds of things. So I guess I wonder if we talk about accountability then in situations where the state and the democratic institutions are captured, because I think while you were talking about tactical constraints on anti-corruption or the tactics that politicians use to avoid proper scrutiny or proper accountability, I think there are also structural or underlying reasons why that structure remains the same beyond politicians being able to wiggle out of corruption cases and things like that. So I wonder if rather than talking about accountability, because that implies rectifying an accountability relationship, we should talk about social activism in relation to change and actually a change in how those relationships are formed. And so I'm actually quite interested in those situations in which social activism leads to more permanent change. So the structure doesn't remain the same after social activism. And I think that's a puzzle we confront across the world. So if you look at a lot of surveys around corruption, many different countries, corruption is cited along with unemployment as the main problem facing countries. So people feel it's a problem. It's not like people tolerate or condone corruption. They don't, on the whole. They may be resigned to it, but they still see it as some kind of anathema, and they understand that it's obviously hindering development. But the puzzle is that we don't really see more social activism. We don't see more people on the streets, given that it's an area in which the government has direct control over. So something like jobs or the economy, it's very difficult for a government to suddenly reform an economic system to create new jobs, but they can reform a state, or they can get rid of corruption quite easily. So I think it's a puzzle a little bit why we don't see more widespread social activism, or at least social activism that leads to more long-lasting change. And I guess I just wanted briefly to map out maybe the aspects of this puzzle. And maybe I was going to ask Moses, from your success stories, whether you have any answers to these puzzles, which I think people, both the practitioner community but also the research community, are interested. And I think these puzzles represent the different steps of social activism or change that can emerge from social activism. So the first is, I think, where do the first movers come from? How do you form a coalition of the zealots, of the hardcore, who are willing to put their lives, reputation at risk, are willing to face repercussions from government, to be active against corruption? Because we know that societies move from a state of, let's say, systemic corruption to less corruption when a coalition starts exercising some kind of unrelenting pressure on the government. So these first movers are always very important. They've always been important in history. I mean, if you look at America, for example, the United States, which was very corrupt in the 19th century, it was a mix of farmers and businessmen and Protestant groups who were just sick of the status quo, who started breaking away from conventional norms to challenge the system. So it's this mobilization in the first instance, and obviously there are structural reasons in authoritarian regimes, it's very difficult to do this, but even in non-authoritarian regimes, we see that sometimes that this activism is donor-driven, that it's not grassroots, it's not organic. So I'm wondering if you've detected anything about these, I guess, leaders of campaigns. Is there anything in their history, in their background, in their education, where they came from, which explains why they have emerged and not others? Then the second step, I think, is around how do you go from 100 people in a square to 100,000 people in the square? So how do you go from being a pressure group to being a society-wide movement? So where does the snowball effect come from? I'm not sure if we saw this in Ghana, but we've seen it in many other countries recently, and we see it at the moment. Places like Chile and Iran and Iraq, corruption is part of the protesting story there. And the reason why this is important is because many argue that to actually really address corruption, you need this equilibrium shift. You need the losers of corruption, so that's mainly society at large, to organize and to send a signal that corruption is no longer tolerated. But the puzzle is, we don't see these equilibrium shifts. We don't see these snowballing effects that often. So again, what explains those situations where we do see it? Is it something structural? Is it about the change in the economy? Do people suddenly have more time because of the change in the means of production? Is it something to do with society? Suddenly, is there less deference to authority in society? Did some punk bands start breaking the bonds of deference in society? Or maybe something to do with the social cost of activism, that being lowered for some reason. I remember I spent a lot of time in the Balkans, and I saw some protests against corruption in the main square of a town, and the only people protesting were the older generation who have nothing to lose because they're retired, and then a hardcore group of activists. The younger generation who have the most to lose from corruption were sitting in the cafes watching the protest, and actually in a rather mocking way. And the reason was that actually you don't want to rock the boat because powerful people may not be vengeful, but they may overlook you for a job or a position and something. Yeah. So maybe it's to do with the social costs being lowered. Or is it something, again, more tactical? Was there new technology that emerged suddenly which enabled these things, or new forms of leadership? Then the third aspect that I think is a puzzle is how to pop the balloons. So I know Inga likes to use this metaphor of corruption as a balloon, that you can squeeze one part of the balloon, so you can put pressure on one part, but the corruption will just shift. So that means it may shift to a different sector, it may shift
seen a lot of that.
In a different form. So the question is, how do you pop that balloon rather than just squeezing it? How do you actually achieve deep-seated change? Because, of course, we know that corrupt actors also fight back. And, of course, popping the balloon rarely happens. You rarely see a change overnight, but you can also, there may be a way to squeeze the balloon so the corruption falls out, where afterwards there is a genuine redistribution of power. So the system, the structure, the corruption structure changes, or there's a genuine commitment to act. So I'm interested in, once the 100,000 people on the street, how do you ensure that it's not just the balloon being squeezed? So what kind of engagements take place? Is it then about dialogue, political dialogue between protesters, the leaders and politicians? Do protesters use media strategies? Is there a role for donors in ensuring that the energy of activism translates into more permanent change?
Yeah, donors and the international community. You have a number of international organizations, civil society, NGOs, who want to create the same kind of pressure elsewhere as they have.
Yeah.
As I say, it is partly a question of making those who lose out from corruption understand that they are losing out, that is to overcome the obstacles created by the government in terms of their discourse and their ability to put pressure, their ability to co-opt and make people into clients of the system. So there is a question of understanding, and there is also a question of how much they actually lose out. I mean, it has to be felt directly, I should think. And also sometimes people are asking for some wins. The activists need to see that they can gain something, that they can have some wins in this fight. What have you seen then from Ghana in these terms?
Well, let me circle back a little bit, and I'll begin from where David began. When I was still an idealistic young man going to graduate school and having lofty ideas about changing the world, and all of you guys, especially those of you who are still in school, you should have aspirations to change the world. That's a great thing. But one of the things we debated early on in graduate school was, why aren't there so many social revolutions in Africa? Why is it that so much goes wrong and so little is done to protest and to upend the status quo and to bring about change? So David is kind of raising that question of, why is it difficult to shift the equilibrium and to move the needle away from, this seemingly permanent equilibrium where so much wrongdoing can go on and there are no consequences, whether legal or social. And I think that remains a very important puzzle and a very important research question for us social scientists. And there are no easy answers. There's no one bullet answer to that question. I mean, part of the explanation, of course, comes from the social fragmentation of many African nations, not just Ghana, but so the social structure in many African countries tends to work against collective action. We know collective action is something that is difficult to do. It requires fast movers, as David was saying, and oftentimes you need that critical mass of individuals and groups who are interested enough to move fast, and then then other people can join. Now, but if I may hazard a guess, and comes partly from our experience studying the Ghanaian case, the recent demographic shift in many African countries, I think, portends some possible sources of big change to happen. And by demographic change, I mean the increasing trend towards most African countries having far more young people than than old people. The youth, exactly. So the youth explosion, and again, we can't read too much into it, but I think there is something there, because if you look at what the pressure that came up in Ghana in recent years against corruption was pressure driven in large measure by young people and social media activists. The Occupy Ghana organization, NGO that I spoke about earlier, is largely comprised of young lawyers and individuals of a generation different from the old generation of the old politics, the kind of politics in Ghana that scholars have previously referred to as big man politics. So if there is to be a major social shift that can contribute towards transforming the structure of politics and the structure of society as well, I think the demographic transformation might play an important role.
You did.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. You did mention a few wins.
Yes.
In Ghana.
Yeah.
And you also had some ideas in the chapter of what caused these wins, what kind of coalitions, what kind of pressures were effective.
Yeah. So I think, that's an important question. Some of the cases we analyzed in Ghana underscore the coordination between the media and civil society. Mm-hmm. So media exposes feeding into civil society activism, and civil society activism becoming important for media investigative journalism. Cases like, in fact, all the cases we analyzed are cases that were extensively reported on by the media, consistently and relentlessly, okay? Such that, pressure came to bear on otherwise, big politicians in the government. The Minister of Health, whose name I mentioned earlier, Richard Anane, was in fact forced to step down because of intense and unrelenting media pressure. And the civil society activists, Occupy Ghana and others, have also done a lot in terms of getting important documents and important information and passing it over to the media. So I think that coordination.
You also mentioned some individuals who were better informed, better educated, leading some of these pressures, lawyers, well-trained activists.
That's true. I think that does make a difference as well. Having leaders of civil society, of course, there's always the question of, as David was asking, how does leadership emerge organically and not be rather superficial by way of, many of the programs and projects around things to do with corruption tend to be, have some donor involvement and to be externally authored and externally, bankrolled, which ends up being a problem. I mean, it's a good thing for outsiders and external actors to help bring about change, but sustainable and meaningful change has to have some organic, rootedness. But if you look at the recent trends in Ghana, you see, young, educated, and very focused, activists who are leading causes, social causes, including this fight against corruption. And I think it makes a difference that the leadership and those at the front lines of fighting corruption understand the law, have a good grasp of procedural issues, and they, have the, social capital and social networks to be able to leverage resources and have the cause they are fighting for move forward and not be, pushed back by counter measures and counter activities of those that are being targeted. And some of the cases we studied, you see that half victories were achieved because those involved were caught not to be in full grasp of what the issues are and how the processes are to be handled. So having, I think, competent, qualified, and experienced activists leading some of the initiatives can definitely make a difference.
We could talk about these countermeasures, how governments are protecting themselves from protests, but we have to wait and open the floor to the audience because there could well be some burning questions or some interesting comments from you. So, anybody, please ask, please comment if you want. If not, yes, Aslak.
Yeah, my name is Aslak Orre. I'm a researcher here at the Christian Michelsen Institute. I have a question for Moses. I was very interested in the first comment you made in your last intervention now about the importance of youth and your apparent optimism that this can bring about major changes in the fight against corruption and perhaps also authoritarianism. The reason why I'm interested is that I'm involved in a long research project about the importance of youth on the youth bulge in Africa, the demographic changes you pointed to, and how that may play out against the many authoritarian regimes in post-liberation Africa. Now, so my question to you is I kind of want to share your optimism, but history tells us that there are so many occasions where there has been social upheaval and there has been regime change, and only that we find that even after regime change, after some initial ideological movement changes and some change in the personnel on top of society, you find that society sort of reverts back to the old habits of clientelism. Because in the lieu of strong institutions to sort of serve as alternatives to the traditional patrimonialism and clientelism structures of power in Africa, which I think is the real source of what we call corruption. Now, why do you think that the new youth bulge really would change that?
Yeah.
Did you get my question?
Yes,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the young people in Africa are trying to escape. Rather.
Like, what makes this generation
Sure,
different? You
yeah.
know?
Can I respond to that, Inge?
Yes.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, this is a great question. My optimism is guarded optimism. And so I'm with you on that. It's not that I think that the youth somehow are going to be the magic wand and the magic bullet to change around things. But and as a social scientist, I always tell myself to never venture into predicting anything, because we social scientists are terrible at prediction, yet we always want to do so. And economists all the time want to predict for us how the economy is going to be like tomorrow, and 9 out of 10 times they get it wrong, but still they continue predicting. Nobody ever saw the collapse of the Soviet Union arriving in 1989. And whole careers were upended and collapsed because people had been counting on studying the Soviet Union even as it was about to collapse, and nobody knew it was going to collapse. So, but if I were to venture into predicting something along those lines, I would say the latest and the likely biggest threat and the autocracy's dilemma is going to be the youth force, the demographic shift. And why should it be? And you're absolutely right that we've had cases in the past of a new idealistic group of people coming into power in an African country, and they are relatively young, and they sort of bring freshness and new ideals. It happened in my own country, Uganda. I'm from Uganda, and in 1986, these guys who captured power, most of them were quite young, including the president himself. He was, at least officially, I think in the lower 40s. So he was relatively young. He wasn't a youth, but most of the people around him were very young. I mean, the army commander, the head of the military, was like 28 years old. You had most ministers who came as fellows who had been fighting. They were all in 20s, 30s. And they came with this idealism. They had been influenced in some ways by Marxist, Leninist thinking about revolution and about transforming a poor agrarian country. And they promised a lot. But as you rightly said, they have ended up being worse than the previous regimes that we had in terms of corruption. The current regime in Uganda is far more corrupt than previous governments. Previous governments may have been, very bad on human rights violations and that kind of stuff. But this one, in terms of especially political corruption, it's worse. And so the reproduction of clientelism, all the clientelism and patronage politics, which is what Museveni's rule is about. Museveni's rule is patronage rule. So how do we know that it will be different this time around? Or how can we say that it will be different this time around? I wouldn't necessarily argue that it will be different. It may not be different, but it might be different. And why I think it might be different is because I think the dynamics are quite different. We live in a completely different world era today, and we live in an era where many young people have a lot at stake. And so, for example, youth unemployment is a big nightmare for most African governments. The population surges in many countries has been, on the march. In a country like Uganda and other, Tanzania and others, population growth rates have been quite phenomenal, and youth unemployment. So you have far more educated young people than you had 20, 30 years ago. You have, so many young people who have aspirations that are of this era and not the past era, and who may have completely different worldview and who are not beholden to the old system. And so I think that they are likely to view things differently and they might bring about change. Now, as to whether the change they bring about or the change that comes because of the demographic shift is change that is for the good for the long term, that definitely I can't vouch for it. We may end up reproducing the old system. That's also possible. That's what I would say.
What do you say, David, about all these youth movements that are going on? Seems to be on the increase in Iraq, in Egypt, in Sudan, you name it.
Yes. So I would agree with both Aslak and Moses that I would agree with Aslak that we cannot say there's any kind of inevitability about increased youth translating into some kind of new political movements which challenge and then overwhelm the status quo or the structures of clientelist politics. But Moses could be right. There may be something qualitatively different about young people today, which may give some scope for change. So what I'm probably interested in then is how the extent to which these young people are organizing themselves and in what form. So do we, I don't know. So do we and you're right, in Iraq, it's young people, but unless they organize themselves into some kind of political entities, coherent political entities, it may be very easy to start dividing and then ruling over them once again via clientelism. So I guess I don't have an answer to it, but do we see within the youth movements nascent forms of political organization, coherent political organization that can hint at departures from clientelist politics? Because I saw it in the Balkans, it's the same issue, and that example of the square where the young people were just drinking coffees, mocking the protesters. The explanation I would have for that is that they are worried that they would not be in receipt of some kind of patronage if they rock the vote. Without any political protection, let's say. Political protection comes from organization and political parties.
We are running out of time. Are there any burning...
I think the gentleman at the back had a question.
Yes.
Yep. Yes. Yeah, him. Yes. No, I mean him. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, my name is Per. I'm affiliated here, writing on mostly social media and technology. And I was interested when you mentioned the #Occupy Ghana tag. And I'm curious how you think about movements in social media. First, what happens when this action in the streets is over? Does it die out in social media, or is there a continuation? Does the movements on social media reshape into organized groups with maybe deeper or continuous thinking around their issue? And secondly, you mentioned former uprisings that were influenced by Marxism and Leninism, which means that there must have been some evangelists in the background teaching about Marxism and Leninism. And then I wonder, have we left a huge space unattended, which is social media, where social scientists or politicians or donors are absent, totally absent, and leaving a gigantic space to itself, where at random ideas are grown and developed and spread. Do you have any comments?
As we are running out of time, this will have to be the last word, so formulate it carefully.
I'll use 30 seconds. You know, you've raised a very important question, the second one. Let me go the second first. You know, movements that happened on the African continent in the 70s and 80s were locally rooted but very ideologically anchored. And you had study groups of young university students, you know, working and getting intellectual mentoring from university professors. And that made a very big difference in the manner in which those movements organized. So if you're talking about the APRDF in Ethiopia and the NRA in Uganda, you know, both, you know, countries and organizations I have studied previously in my work, these were very intellectually anchored movements, and it made a difference in how they approached military organization and how they saw their modus operandi in government once they captured. But of course, as I said, they strayed along the way and ended up with rather disappointing outcomes. But the thing about social media today, and I have tried to do a bit of work in Uganda myself by trying to get young people to you know, work with me in a study group and have them read some material that can help their thinking and inform their citizenship, you know, world views. It's a big indictment what you're saying to many of us who are especially in academia. You know, I don't have a hat worth wearing to mentor young people. There are people who are, I think, more qualified and more competent than me, but who are not doing what you're saying. And especially because of the power and the potential with social media today. So many young people in social media platforms, but who lack you know, proper and structured thinking, and who would benefit from, you know, mentoring and ideas of more experienced scholars. But somehow there's a lot of resignation, you know. You go to many of these countries and relatively older people and, you know, mid-career scholars are, you know, occupied with their own lives, and, you know, the passion for the common good isn't there, you know. And then just lastly, quickly to your first question, I think social media is a double-edged sword. You have a lot of work being done through online activism, but translating that into actual action can be problematic. And, you know, you'll find many young people who say, well, you know, I have contributed by posting something on Facebook and on Twitter, or, you know, making a comment somewhere. But that's not enough, you know, because the action to change society has to happen in real society, not in the virtual world of Twitter and Facebook. So I think there's a lot for us to learn about how does the interplay between virtual online activism and actual on the ground engagement happen, and how is it possible for, you know, street engagement to benefit from online activism and vice versa. And I think I haven't known enough about that issue. It's something very much worth looking into. Thanks.
Okay, we could have gone on, but we have to close and release people. So should we give these guys a hand? Thank you, and hopefully we will see you for the next sessions.
Want somebody take us a photo? No, somebody can.
Maybe the lady.
Okay. Hey, can you help take us a photo here? Can you help take us a photo?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, okay, yeah. That makes sense.
Men that they have made so small that nobody can see it
Yes.
without
Take one with my phone as well. So
Okay. Yeah, good. Yeah. Oh, this is good. Inge was closing his eyes.
I look also half asleep, which I feel, but that's what I'm
Oh, this is nice.
Yeah, that's good. That's very nice.
Okay, you ready?
Yep. And you know what? I'll ask you take. Can I remove this? She'll take us with. Thanks. Huh? This was, I think, it worked well with.
Thanks for coming and for asking a good question. No, nice. You join us tonight?
I don't know, I haven't seen him, so I think so. No, I don't know. I think we're right.
Because sometimes because havana zvinowana results akho in terms of
Yes, you've been away also. So, yeah, maybe we go for lunch later, if you're around. Yeah. You guys, I don't think so. But I'm going in the canteen.
Yeah.
When do you go normally?
No, I'm going 11:30. Yeah. Okay.